Today, we'll be revisiting more of the biggest fallers, or what consensus deemed the biggest steals of the 2019 NFL Draft. In my last two videos, I discussed the biggest reaches and fallers of the 2019 Draft. However, for the fallers video, I only talked about players who were ranked by consensus as first or second round picks, and in the reaches video, I only talked about players who were taken by the NFL in the first or second round. But for these next two videos, we have no restrictions. In this video, I'll be discussing even more of the biggest fallers or steals of the 2019 NFL Draft, including guys I left out from the other video, guys who fell from day 2 to day 3, or just others who dropped a large amount of spots from their consensus board ranking. Because these guys are later round guys, there are a lot more names in this video, so we'll likely spend a little bit less time on each name. So if you'd like a more in-depth dive into the players, including some of the bigger names in the 2019 Draft, make sure to watch the first two videos in this series first. Anyways, if you want to know how I compiled this list, how I scored the competition and all that jazz, I'll put a graphic on screen explaining all of that, so feel free to take the time and read it. Otherwise, let's jump right in. We'll start with Alabama safety Deonte Thompson, a 4-star recruit who declared for the draft early after a junior season with 79 tackles, 4 TFLs, 4 forced fumbles, 6 PBUs, and 2 interceptions. After this excellent season, where he was named First Team All-American and First Team All-SEC, consensus would place him at number 50 overall on the consensus big board, a second-round pick. However, due to a degenerative knee condition, Thompson fell all the way to the 5th round, being picked by the Cardinals at 139 overall, a fall of 89 spots from his consensus rank. Despite being a 5th-round pick, Thompson had a chance to start for the Cardinals very early in his career. You see, after week 4 of Thompson's rookie season, the Cardinals cut safety DJ Swearinger, who had played on every defensive snap for the Cardinals that season. With Swearinger gone, Deonte was pitted against fellow rookie Jalen Thompson, who was picked in the 5th round of the supplemental draft. The Thompson versus Thompson battle would last 4 weeks, from week 5 to week 9. In that time, Jalen would play in 169 snaps, and Deonte would play in 198. But Jalen made more of his snaps, collecting 21 tackles and averaging a 61.9 PFF grade, whereas Deonte would only manage 14 tackles and average a 52 PFF grade. Not a huge difference in a small sample size, but Jalen was a bit more impressive. But what really hurt Deonte though was the fact that his knee injury flared up, causing him to miss time, ultimately leading to him only playing 2 more games in the rest of that season before being declared inactive in the Cardinals' final 4 games. With Deonte out, Jalen Thompson took over, starting the rest of the season, and actually remains the Cardinals' starting safety in 2024. With Jalen Thompson and Budda Baker in the Cardinals' backfield the next season, this left Deonte Thompson as the odd man out, relegating him to a rotational role in just his second year. He'd play in 13 games totaling 332 snaps, he'd break up 3 passes and make 27 tackles, but he'd miss 20% of his tackling attempts and only managed a 54.6 PFF grade. Deonte's role would further diminish in his third year, where he'd primarily play special teams, only playing 71 defensive snaps and totaling 8 tackles. The writing was on the wall, and unfortunately the next season, nobody cleaned it off. Thompson would be waived by the Cardinals in late September, he'd sign with the Jaguars practice squad about a month later, and then he'd ultimately be released before the start of the 2023 season, where he was out of the NFL entirely. This makes it pretty easy to find that the NFL was right on Deonte Thompson. 2024 will be the second straight year where he hasn't played an NFL snap, and he didn't show enough in his limited starting time to intrigue teams enough to take a flyer on him or stash him on the practice squad. He got a shot early enough to make a name for himself, but unfortunately he was outplayed by a fellow rookie, and his injury made it difficult for him to bounce back and play himself into a starting role. For that reason, we give the point to the NFL, who desperately needs one after getting schmacked in the last video. We'll stay in the defensive backfield with our next player, cornerback Jimmy Moreland of James Madison, an absolute ball hawk in college with 63 PBUs and 18 interceptions. After seeing his dominance in college, he was ranked as the 138th overall player on the consensus big board. But in the NFL draft, he wouldn't be taken until the 7th round, when the Commanders selected him 227th overall, a fall of 89 spots. Moreland was a surprise contributor for Washington in his rookie year, starting 5 games and playing in 14, totaling 471 snaps. The results, however, were unspectacular. Of the 40 targets against him, he allowed 33 of them to be caught, allowing the 6th highest completion percentage allowed of 137 qualifying corners. He also allowed 1 reception every 8.5 coverage snaps, the 26th worst rate, and his 110.4 passer rating allowed was the 31st worst in the league. His 8 missed tackles, giving him a missed tackle rate of 16.7%, didn't particularly help either, as that was the 22nd worst missed tackle rate for cornerbacks. Although he did manage to break up 4 passes, this wasn't considered a successful rookie season for Moreland. But he would see increased playing time the next season, still starting 5 games, but playing in 16. totaling 601 snaps. In those snaps, he'd intercept one pass, break up one other, force a fumble, make 18 defensive stops, and rack up 44 tackles. But the season was ultimately still not a good one. Allowing 51 receptions on 71 targets, his 71.8 completion percentage allowed was the 14th worst in the NFL. He was targeted once every 5.6 snaps, the 10th worst rate, and allowed a reception once every 7.8 snaps, the 7th worst rate. Alongside his struggles in coverage, he regressed as a tackler, missing almost 23% of his tackling attempts, the second worst rate for cornerbacks in 2020. But going into 2021, Moreland was still considered the presumptive starter and was even considered a potential breakout candidate, which is why it was a shock to Washington fans when he was cut in August before the 2021 season began. But I think I've uncovered some kind of conspiracy here that might explain why he was cut. You see how this extremely insightful J.K. Dobbins article is ham-fisted in the middle of these articles about Jimmy Moreland, ruining the visual storytelling I could have achieved by having these 3 articles lined up together? Well, I didn't put it there. Apparently, the Fox Sports website thought this article was relevant to Jimmy Moreland. You might think this is a mistake. Why don't we just think about it for a second, okay? On January 13th, 2021, RotoWire says that Moreland probably did enough to keep the same role and might even compete for an outside corner spot. Good. In July of 2021, people are talking about whether Moreland can impress. Things are looking up. Then, in August, J. Now, I don't know what J is, but apparently J results in Jimmy Moreland being cut a mere 3 days later, after everything was looking real good for Jimbo. But what does J mean? Well, we see the article says something about J.K. Dobbins, who missed the entirety of the 2021 season with a torn ACL. Do you know who else missed the entirety of the 2021 season? James Madison cornerback Jimmy Moreland. Who else is named Jimmy? Jimmy Buffett, who shares a last name with Warren Buffett. What is Warren Buffett known for? Being rich. Who is rich? Bisaccia, who took over for Jon Gruden in that very year, 2021, because John was fired in part for inappropriate emails that he sent about the first openly J player in the NFL, Michael Sam. Jon Gruden's brother's name is Jay, who coached what team? Washington, and was mysteriously out of football in only 2021 as he worked for the Jags in 2020 and the Rams in 2022. How many letters are in the name Jay? 3. How many days after Jay was Jimmy cut? 3. There's only one conclusion that we can draw here. Jimmy Moreland is the third Gruden brother, and the NFL forced Washington to cut him because they were about to uncover the Gruden email scandal. It's all so obvious. Okay, I'm not gonna lie, I feel kinda bad about photoshopping the Gruden hair on Moreland here, because he looks like such a pleasant fellow. Either way, Moreland has since bounced around from team to team, going from Houston to Philadelphia to the Jets, missing time with injuries on each team before ultimately being released by the Jets in September of 2023. Relative to expectations for a 7th round pick, it is impressive that Moreland was able to carve out a semi-starting role in Washington, even if he wasn't a particularly good player. But the question here is whether he was worth closer to a 4th rounder or a 7th rounder. In general, 4th rounders are expected to be good depth or fringe starters that have a reliable baseline of play that makes teams comfortable enough to play them if a main starter goes down, or to use them in a rotation with other players. Moreland wasn't quite that. Although he started for 2 years, it was more out of necessity than comfort. He struggled to force incompletions and break up passes, he was frequently targeted and gave up receptions on those targets, and he missed a lot of tackles. Since leaving Washington, he's gotten hurt every single year and has struggled to stay healthy, limiting the question of his value to only looking at his first 2 seasons, as 2024 is looking to be the 3rd straight season without playing an NFL snap. Given his poor play when on the field and inability to stick on a roster for the last 3 seasons, I think the NFL is closer to his value than consensus was. For that reason, I give the point to the NFL. We'll move to Texas defensive lineman Charles Omenihu, the Big 12 Defensive Lineman of the Year in 2018 after a senior season with 9.5 sacks. Omenihu was ranked by consensus as the 81st overall player in the 2019 draft, a 3rd round value. But in the draft, he wouldn't be taken until the 5th round, 161 overall by the Texans, a draft fall of 80 spots. In his first 2 seasons as a Texan, Omenihu would play in 29 games, starting 5 of them, playing 989 snaps across the 2 seasons. In those snaps, he'd rack up 30 tackles, 4 pass deflections, 7 sacks, 7 TFLs, and 59 total pressures. As a pass rusher, he showed to be a solid rotational player, finishing 21st of 47 and 28th of 52 in pass rush win rate respectively in his first 2 seasons, and he finished 32nd and 23rd in total pressures over that same span. However, Omenihu struggled heavily as a run defender, ranking 107th out of 122 in 2019, then 106th of 115 in 2020. Going into 2021, Omenihu hadn't hit his pass rushing upside and was a liability as a run defender. This led the Texans to trade Omenihu to the 49ers in November of the 2021 season. On the surface, this season looked very poor for Omenihu, as it was his first NFL season without a sack, and he only managed 25 pressures, which was 71st in the NFL. But although he still struggled in run D, grading out as the 115th run defender in the NFL, his advanced stats would show progression as a pass rusher, as a 17.2% pass rush win rate was 9th in the NFL, and his 81.8 pass rush grade was 13th. But what the hell good is that if you have no pressures? I don't know, man. Ask his 2022 season, his best season yet. Omenihu's 16.8 pass rush win rate would finish 7th in the NFL, his 75.3 pass rush grade would finish 15th, and his 54 total pressures were the 20th most in the NFL. He'd end that season with 4.5 sacks, 1 pass deflection, 1 forced fumble, 3 TFLs, and 10 defensive stops. He was still a very poor run defender, ranking 52nd overall of 57 qualifiers, but he had finally made enough impact as a pass rusher to justify staying on the field. Coming off the back of this excellent season, the Chiefs would sign Omenihu to a 2-year, $16 million deal, which is the 40th highest APY for edge rushers in 2024. Omenihu would be suspended for the first 6 games of the 2023 season for violating the NFL's personal conduct policy, but would have another strong season in 2023. Playing 403 snaps, he totaled 7 sacks, 2 pass deflections, 2 forced fumbles, 28 tackles, and 29 pressures. Unfortunately, Omenihu would tear his ACL in the 2024 AFC Championship game, causing him to miss the Super Bowl and resulting in him being put on the PUP list in 2024. When deciding whether this point should go to the NFL or consensus, I think it's important to note how Omenihu has been used. In his first 2 seasons with the Texans, he was used as more of an interior defensive lineman. In 2019 and 2020, he played 221 snaps in either the A-gap or B-gap, 152 snaps over the tackle, and 108 snaps outside of the tackle. In this role, he averaged a pass rush win rate of 9%, 1 pressure every 11.35 snaps, and a 56.8 PFF grade. However, after getting traded to the 49ers, his usage was completely different. From 2021 to 2023, Omenihu had only played 66 snaps on the inside, 76 snaps over the tackle, and he had 296 snaps outside of the tackle. He was clearly much better as an edge rusher, averaging a pressure every 8.1 snaps, a pass rush win rate of 15.3%, and a PFF grade of 67.2, all improvements over his time as an interior defensive lineman. Obviously, this isn't a clean split because players almost just generally tend to get better over time, but there's enough of a sample size across multiple teams for me to believe that he started off so slow because he was just in the wrong role. Now, to be fair to the Texans, they used him completely how he was used in college, so it's not like they tried to move him around or put him in a foreign position. It's really just more of a credit to the 49ers staff that they saw the potential of Omenihu to play him from a different alignment. But now it's time for the dreaded question: who was right? On one hand, his first 3 seasons definitely weigh him down, and his trade value at that time of a future 6th round pick makes it difficult to find that he was worth a 3rd rounder. On the other hand, you do generally expect a 3rd rounder to take longer to develop, and you don't expect them to be an impact player immediately. You ideally want them to develop and be a solid starter in a few years or a good rotational player. Omenihu has showed 1 season of good rotational play, but otherwise he's been about a league average rotational player. He's always struggled in run defense, making him a limited player, and he's missed time due to injuries and suspension. I like Omenihu as a player, but looking at how his career has gone so far into 2024, I think saying that he's been worth a 3rd round value at this time would be a stretch. I think 4th or 5th is perfect for him when balancing his 1 season of high-level play and 40th APY at his position against his poor trade value, lack of starting time, being only 11 starts in his career, his limited role as a pass rusher only, and his consistently average to below average advanced metrics. I do have to say that I went back and forth on this one several times and I really struggled to pick a side. Maybe I'm being too harsh, and I definitely think he can justify a 3rd round value in future years, but I think based on what we've seen so far, without projecting forward, it's more justifiable to give this point to the NFL. 3-0. Next up is our first offensive player, Washington running back Myles Gaskin, whose 5,323 yards and 57 touchdowns over his collegiate career make him the 3rd all-time leading rusher in Pac-12 history and Washington's all-time leading rusher. These numbers led consensus to place him at 170 overall on the consensus big board, but on draft day, he fell 64 spots to 234 overall when he was picked by the Dolphins in the 7th round. As a rookie, Gaskin wasn't particularly involved, only carrying the ball 36 times for 133 yards and adding 7 receptions for 51 yards. However, in 2020, his 2nd season, he broke onto the scene as Miami's premier back, averaging almost 14 carries a game and 5 receptions a game through his first 6 games, where he'd have 82 carries for 340 yards and adding 27 receptions for 182 yards. This led to Gaskin having some great fantasy outputs and made him an excellent trade candidate for my 2020 fantasy team when I traded him away in exchange for Amari Cooper. Thanks, Raph. I appreciate you. Unfortunately for Raph, though, Gaskin would spend a good majority of the rest of the season on IR or on the COVID list, missing 6 games and only playing in 4 more. He did pretty well in those 4 games, finishing the season with 142 attempts for 584 yards and 3 rushing touchdowns, alongside 41 receptions for 388 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. Advanced metrics would paint him as a slightly above average to league average back, as his 31 missed tackles forced was 20th of 61, his 360 yards after contact were 38th, and his 49.9 PFF elusiveness rating was 33rd. But his production was enough to retain the starting role for the start of 2021, where he'd rumble for 612 yards on 173 carries, 3 of which went for rushing touchdowns, and he'd add 49 receptions for 234 yards and 4 receiving touchdowns. He played in all 17 games, starting 10 of them, but he fell off quite a bit, eventually losing his job to the dynamic 1-2 punch of Philip Lindsay and Duke Johnson. His 2021 season was a downgrade from his 2020 season in just about every way, as his yards per carry dropped from 4.1 to 3.5, he'd finished 40th in missed tackles forced, despite having more carries, and his PFF elusiveness rating would drop to 28.5, placing him at 55th of 61 qualifying running backs. Gaskin would stay in Miami for the 2022 season, but he was inactive for 11 games and only carried the ball 10 times for 26 yards. He'd re-signed with Miami in March of 2023, but was released only a few months later, and then bounced around between the Vikings active roster and their practice squad for the entire month of September. In October, he'd signed with the Rams, but was released in November, and then he signed back to the Vikings practice squad. As of week 5 of the 2024 season, Gaskin is on the Vikings active roster and has 3 attempts for -1 yards and 1 reception for 1 yard. So who do we give the point to? In many ways, Gaskin is similar to Jimmy Moreland. 2 years of being a team starter, and not much else. But there are a few things that distinguish Gaskin from Moreland. For one, for consensus to be right, Gaskin only has to live up to the value of a 5th rounder, whereas Moreland had to be a 4th round value. Second, Gaskin was a much better player when he was a starter, grading out at about league average most of the time, whereas Moreland consistently graded out as one of the worst cornerbacks in the league. Third, Gaskin has hung around his depth for another team and is still playing in the NFL today, but Moreland hasn't played an NFL snap in 3 seasons. Fourth, PFR places Gaskin's approximate value at 13, but Moreland's is only at 5. It is still tough though. On one hand, you don't expect a 7th rounder to ever be a starter. On the other hand, Gaskin was only a starter for about a year and a half, and some of that year and a half he spent on IR. It's especially hard when you consider the fact that with running backs these days, it feels like you could practically take any 7th rounder or undrafted free agent and plug them in and they'll play at least somewhat well. So in that way, Gaskin probably underperformed if you compare him to guys like Philip Lindsay, Elijah Mitchell, James Robinson, and similar players. But I think because we've had a few toss-ups at this point, and I've given them all to the NFL, I'm going to give this point to consensus, because I feel like it could have gone to them on Gaskin, Omenihu, or Moreland, and they've all just been so close, and I think that there's enough things to distinguish Moreland from Gaskin. But if you disagree on any of the prior ones, just pretend this point was given to consensus for them, and we're all good. If you have any other strong takes though, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Unless you're not subscribed, like 96% of you, what are you doing? Hit the subscribe button, man. But seriously though, if you're not subscribed, I still want to hear from you. At this point, we still have 5 bigger names that I'll break down in depth. However, there are a lot of guys who flamed out rather quickly, so we could just do some quick hitters before getting to our bigger names. Oklahoma running back Rodney Anderson, once ranked by 247 Sports as the number 2 running back in the country in his high school recruiting class, was viewed by consensus as the 130th best player in the 2019 class. But there were concerns going into the draft because in 4 college seasons, he suffered season-ending injuries in 3 of them: a broken leg, a neck injury, and a torn ACL. The Bengals took the swing on Anderson in the 6th round, 211 overall, ending his fall at 81 spots. But unfortunately for Anderson, he'd re-tear the same ACL in the final preseason game for the Bengals, causing him to miss the entirety of his rookie season. The next season, he'd be waived after failing a physical, and he never signed with another team, ending his NFL career without having played a single regular season snap. Georgia edge rusher DeAndre Walker was ranked by consensus as the 93rd best player in the 2019 draft class, but he wasn't taken until 168 overall by the Titans in the 5th round, a fall of 75 spots. Like Anderson, Walker suffered a knee injury during training camp and would miss the entirety of his rookie year. The next season, Walker would be cut on September 5th, 2020, without ever having played a single snap for the Titans. The next day, he'd signed with the Seahawks, and he stayed with them for a few weeks, logging a single defensive snap. but he'd ultimately be cut on September 29th, 2020. Since that point, he hasn't spent any time on an NFL roster, and 2024 will now be his 4th straight season out of the NFL. Texas A&M running back Travion Williams declared for the draft as a junior after a 2018 season with 1,524 rushing yards and 15 touchdowns, earning him first team All-SEC second team and the 111th spot on the consensus big board. However, quote, scouts weren't really feeling him, unquote, causing him to fall to the 6th round, 182 overall, when the Bengals stopped his draft fall at 71 spots. Williams would play on special teams for the Bengals in 2019, but wouldn't receive his first carry as a running back until 2020, when he carried the ball 26 times for 157 yards. His usage would decline the next season, only toting the rock 15 times for 51 yards. The next year, he'd see the ball even less, but not because his eyesight was worse, it's because he was given the ball less times than the year before, only carrying 6 times for 30 yards. But the next season, his eyesight would get better, as he'd see the ball more. He also received more carries, bumping up his attempts to 15 carries for 69 nice yards. Williams has mostly been a kick returner or punt returner, but only has 33 career returns. He's been on league minimum money for 2 years in a row with the Bengals, and the most offensive touches he's had in a season was 31. Georgia offensive lineman Lamont Racarius Gilliard was ranked by consensus as the 116th overall player, a 4th round value. However, Gilliard wouldn't be taken until the 6th round, 179 overall by the Cardinals, a draft fall of 63 spots. Interestingly enough, Gilliard was taken with the pick that the Cardinals got when they traded Bruce Arians to the Buccaneers. Safe to say, that wasn't a fair trade. The Buccaneers got a Super Bowl, and the Cardinals got a player with a last name that is dangerously close to Gaylord, which is only significant because of the connection to Gaylord Fokker and isn't at all funny for any other reason. Gilliard wouldn't play his first snaps until 2020, where he totaled 217 snaps and played rather poorly. He was waived in July of 2021 by the Cardinals and signed to the practice squad of Cincy and Miami before being released. Gilliard's Georgia teammate, wide receiver Riley Ridley, brother of professional gambler Calvin Ridley, was viewed by consensus as the 67th best player in the NFL draft, a 3rd round value. However, in the draft, he'd wait an extra round, being picked by Da Bears at 126 overall, a 59 spot drop. Despite being healthy in his rookie season, Ridley was inactive for 10 of his first 11 games. He'd be activated due to injuries to the wide receiving core, and would play 108 offensive snaps that year, catching 6 passes for 69 nice yards. The next season, he'd see the field for only 41 offensive snaps, catching 4 passes for 49 yards. Going into 2021, he was waived by the Bears and hasn't seen an NFL field since 2020. He's since picked up a new career. Florida linebacker Voshon Joseph, ranked as a 3rd rounder, 101 overall on the consensus big board, wasn't taken until the 5th round, 147 overall by the Bills, a 46 spot fall. Unfortunately, Joseph was placed on IR in August of his rookie season, causing him to miss the whole year. In September of the next year, he'd be waived by the Bills, and he hasn't signed with an NFL team since then, ending his career without having played a single NFL snap. The last of our quick hitters is Michigan State cornerback Justin Layne, who ranked in the top 10 in the FBS with 10 pass breakups in his junior season. Layne was viewed by consensus as an early 2nd rounder, ranking 53rd overall on the consensus big board, but he wasn't taken until a round later at 83 overall by the Steelers, a draft fall of 30 spots. Layne would play mostly on special teams in his rookie season, making 3 tackles in 10 games. The next season, he'd get a chance to play defense though, finding himself on the field for 117 defensive snaps. In those snaps, he'd give up 10 receptions on 12 targets, allow a 117 passer rating against him, and he missed 5 tackles. I guess this was enough of a sample size for the Steelers, because the next season he practically spent all of his time on special teams, only playing 28 defensive snaps. In August of 2022, he'd be released and would bounce around from the Giants to the Bears, and then finally to the Panthers, but he never reported to the Panthers. He was eventually released by them in March of 2023, and hasn't been on an NFL team since. Okay, so I don't think that there's any close calls there. All of those go to the NFL, which shouldn't be a surprise at this point, as the last 2 videos seem to show that draft falls favor the NFL and draft reaches favor consensus. But maybe our bigger names will help consensus to make up some ground for the total of the 2019 class. Now, we turn to Minnesota linebacker Blake Cash Money Cashman, a college walk-on who finished his senior season with 104 tackles and 15 TFLs in 12 games. Consensus ranked Cashman as the 95th best player in the class, a 3rd round value, but in the draft, he wouldn't hear his name called until the 5th round, 157 overall, when he was taken by the Jets, a draft fall of 62 spots. The concern with Cashman coming out was that he was extremely injury prone, and boy, did that show up in his first few years in the NFL. In his first season, Cashman played 424 snaps, racking up 40 tackles, 1 PBU, half a sack, and 14 defensive stops. But in November, he'd be placed on IR with a torn labrum and a fractured shoulder. The next season, Cashman would play in Week 1 and would immediately get hurt again, leading to his second IR stint. He'd return in October playing mostly special teams and would yet again injure himself, this time his hamstring. The next season, he'd injure himself in Week 1 again, another hamstring injury. He'd return on October 9th, and only 2 weeks later, on October 21st, he found himself on IR for the 5th time in 3 seasons. This is the point where you usually see these players fall out of the league, but Cashman hung around. In March of 2022, after 3 injury-riddled seasons, the Jets traded Cashman to the Texans for a 2023 6th-round pick. In the 2022 season, Cashman would play in all 16 games, starting 1, but only played 149 defensive snaps. He wasn't overly impressive, but he wasn't bad either, making 26 tackles and 11 defensive stops, breaking up 2 passes, and pressuring the quarterback 11 times, resulting in 3 sacks. Houston would sign Cashman to a 1-year, $2.3 million extension, and Cashman would reward their faith with not only his best year as a pro, but an elite linebacking year by NFL standards. In 2023, Cashman played in 14 games. In 655 snaps, he'd rack up 106 tackles, 9 TFLs, 2 sacks, 5 PBUs, and an interception. His 83.7 PFF grade ranked him as the 4th best linebacker in the NFL of 57 qualifiers. His 84.7 run D grade was 9th, and his 73.5 pass rushing grade was 16th. He was also outstanding in coverage, as his 75.4 coverage grade was 10th in the NFL, his 71.7 completion percentage allowed was the 6th lowest for linebackers, his 83.7 passer rating allowed was the 5th lowest, and his 298 yards allowed were the 8th lowest. After that season, Blake finally lived up to the family name and got that cash, man, locking up a 3-year, $22.5 million contract with the Vikings this offseason, giving him the 18th highest APY among NFL linebackers. Through Week 5 of 2024, he's continued to ball out, starting every game in 2024, running top 10 in PFF grade, run D grade, and coverage grade, while allowing the 3rd lowest completion percentage against and the 9th lowest passer rating against. Although he had a rocky start, Cashman doesn't have to live up to the value of a 1st or 2nd rounder. He only has to meet the value of a 3rd rounder. If we ignore the injuries of it all, you don't expect a 3rd rounder to be an immediate impact, and you ideally want them to come in and be a solid starter or a good rotational piece after their first few seasons. Cashman has blown that away, playing as an elite player for a season and a quarter now. But is that sample size enough? I think comparing him to Omenihu will help us to make this decision. Omenihu has played far more in the NFL, but Cashman has played at a higher level, has already started more games than Omenihu, and is paid like a better player at his position. And honestly, his pay could be higher. It's just lower given the risk of Cashman being injured again. Cashman was also viewed as a borderline 4th by consensus, whereas Omenihu was ranked earlier in the 4th round. I still think I can go back and forth on this one, but because I gave the toss-up to the NFL on Omenihu, I'll lean towards consensus on this one, making it 10-2. Next up is offensive lineman David Edwards, who played tackle at Wisconsin but eventually switched to guard at the NFL level. As one of the lead blockers for Colts running back Jonathan Taylor and a 2nd-team All-Big Ten selection, Edwards was ranked at 107 overall on the consensus big board, a 4th-round value. In the 2019 draft, he was selected in the 5th round, 169 overall by the Rams, a draft fall of 62 spots. As a rookie, Edwards would only play on special teams for his first 6 games, but eventually he got the start, finishing out the final 10 games as one of the Rams' starting offensive guards. In his 689 snaps, he'd grade out as an average player. His 61 PFF grade was 38 of 63, his 64.8 run block grade was 21st, and his 98 pass block efficiency rating was 15th. But his pass blocking grade of 51.6 was 55th in the league, and his 9 penalties were the 2nd most for guards that season. The next year, Edwards would have an excellent season as the Rams' full-time left guard, playing 1,006 snaps. His 70.3 PFF grade was 14th of 60, his 68.9 run block grade was 0.1 points off of being nice and was ranked 19th, his 63.6 pass block grade was 29th, and his 97.9 efficiency grade was 20th. And he was only penalized a single time. Edwards would remain the starter in 2021, helping the Rams to get to the Super Bowl. In that season, he started all 17 regular season games, playing 1,086 snaps, but he regressed a bit, dropping to 35th and 37th in PFF grade and run blocking grade respectively, while having his worst pass block efficiency grading of 96.8, 42nd in the NFL. He also allowed 6 sacks, which was tied for the 6th most in the NFL that season. On the final year of his rookie deal, he'd play in 4 games, and he struggled heavily, allowing 3 sacks and only 152 pass blocking snaps. On top of his decline in play, he suffered multiple concussions, causing the Rams to shut him down for the rest of the season. The Rams, seeing Edwards struggle on the field and struggle to stay healthy that season, decided to let Edwards walk in free agency, where he signed with the Bills to be a backup offensive lineman. Last season, he played in 17 games on special teams or in a sixth offensive lineman type role, and graded out fairly well with an 82.7 PFF grade in 148 snaps. This led Buffalo to sign him to a 2-year, $6 million extension, the 41st APY for offensive guards, and they named him a starter for 2024. Now, 5 weeks into 2024, Edwards has started every game for the Bills at left guard and has the 12th best pass block efficiency rating in the NFL. But who was right? Is he closer to 107th or 169th? Well, Edwards has been a starter for 4 of his 6 years in the NFL. He's never been extremely good, but he's been far from a liability either, which can be pretty rare to find with NFL offensive lines these days. He's the 46th highest weighted approximate value according to PFR, and at a time where we see these 4th rounders with developmental upside flame out and never do anything, Edwards has been a consistent contributor for 2 teams, starting 50 total games. When considering his AV, starting time, and solid production, I think teams would be happy to get a player like him in the 4th round. Point consensus. And next up is Alabama defensive lineman Isaiah Buggs, who was viewed by consensus at 134 overall, a 4th round pick, but he even peaked at number 40 overall on the consensus big board. The NFL wasn't quite as high on him, as he'd fall 58 spots to 192 overall in the 6th round when he was taken by the Steelers. In his first 2 seasons, he'd barely play, only totaling 206 defensive snaps. In those snaps, he got 14 tackles, 11 defensive stops, and he averaged a PFF grade of 51.5. In his 3rd season, he finally got some playing time, playing in 10 games overall, but starting 6 of them. He'd eclipsed his career snap total, playing 227 snaps, but his play wasn't particularly good. He'd only make 17 tackles, 2 TFLs, and 8 stops, while missing almost 21% of his tackling attempts. This led the Steelers to release him before the offseason even came around, as they officially cut him from the roster in January of 2022. In July, Buggs would sign with the Lions and was thrust into a starting role, playing 17 games and getting the start in 13. In his 752 snaps, he'd get 2 pass deflections, 1 forced fumble, 1 sack, 46 tackles, 17 defensive stops, and 20 pressures. It doesn't sound like a ton, but interior defensive lineman is not generally a position that stuffs the stat sheet. It was far from an elite season or even really a good one, but Buggs wasn't terrible, and he seemed to at least carve himself a role as a fringe rotational player or solid depth for a team if a starter had to miss a few games. That's the role he found himself in the next season. After signing a 2-year, $6 million extension with the Lions in March, Buggs would play in 10 games, starting 3, totaling 255 snaps, where he'd get 8 stops, 12 tackles, 1 sack, 1 pass deflection, and 2 TFLs. But with 1 year left on his deal, Buggs was again cut in January, leaving him as a free agent for the 2024 season. He was signed to the Chiefs practice squad that same month and was prepared to go into the 2024 season as a practice squad player for the Chiefs before he was cut in June due to legal issues stemming from a case of animal cruelty. As of today, he's not on the roster. This point clearly goes to the NFL. He's played as a starter for 1 season and wasn't particularly good. Otherwise, he hasn't played, and he isn't even on a team now, 11-3. But just like animals who see Isaiah Buggs, we need some protection. So let's talk about safeties. Specifically, Iowa safety Amani Hooker, the only hooker that I know that'll provide protection. Although maybe if I look through this link to more hooker pages on his PFR page, I could maybe find a few more. Hooker was ranked 72nd overall on the consensus big board, and he was taken in the 4th round at 116 overall by the Titans, a fall of 44 spots. He'd play as a backup safety in his rookie season, playing all 16 games and totaling 335 defensive snaps. Although it was a small sample size, he was elite in coverage in these snaps, as his 53.8% completion percentage allowed was the 10th best in the NFL, and his 72.9 passer rating allowed was the 23rd lowest of 98 qualifying corners. He did, however, struggle as a tackler in run defense, missing 23% of his tackles, the 5th highest rate, and he graded out as the 76th cornerback in run defense that season. The next season, he'd be given 470 snaps, playing in all 16 games again, and he started in 3 of them. He'd again have an excellent season in coverage. Although his 79% completion percentage allowed was the 15th highest, he'd intercept 4 passes, break up 8 others, allow only a 62.4 passer rating, the 10th lowest, and he graded out as the 19th best cornerback in coverage of 99 qualifiers with a 70.8 coverage grade. However, he again struggled in run defense, missing 15% of his tackles, the 23rd highest rate in the NFL, and grading out with a 51.8 run defense grade, 83rd in the NFL. In 2021, Hooker would finally get his chance to start. He missed time with a foot injury, but would start in 12 games that season, totaling 705 snaps. He'd make the most of his opportunity, picking off 1 pass, breaking up 4 others, forcing a fumble, and making 62 tackles and 13 stops. He'd grade out as one of the better safeties in the NFL, as his 83.3 PFF grade was the 4th highest in the NFL, his 83.4 coverage grade was the 8th highest, and he'd improve in run D to a 75.2, the 17th best in the league. Going into the final season of his rookie deal, the Titans locked him up with a 3-year, $33 million contract extension, which at the time of writing gives him the 13th highest APY for NFL safeties and was probably in the top 10 at the time it was signed, although I can't say for sure. Hooker would decline in 2022, but he was also really banged up, missing 8 total games with knee and shoulder injuries. In the 9 games he did start, he'd played 522 snaps and intercept 1 pass, break up 3 others, force a fumble, and had 46 tackles alongside 11 stops. Although he improved the season before, he struggled in run D again, grading out with a 43.8 run D grade, the 91st of 96 qualifiers. And his PFF grade dropped to the 62nd mark in the league. He also wasn't quite as good in coverage, although still above average, dropping to the 29th best in the league. The next season, Hooker would start 14 games and would play 867 snaps, continuing his interception streak with another interception, but this time breaking up 7 passes, forcing a fumble, and making 85 tackles and 19 stops. He improved in most areas, as his run D grade went back up to 22nd in the league, and his PFF grade went back up to 35th, but he did fall to 33rd in coverage, and allowed the 10th most yards in coverage, as well as allowing the 8th highest passer rating against. After week 15, Hooker would suffer another injury, this time to his knee, and he'd be placed on IR yet again. 5 weeks into 2024, Hooker is still the starting safety for the Titans, having started all 4 games of them before their bye in week 5. And I know for a fact that he's keeping his interception streak alive, because as I was doing the research for this video, I just watched him intercept Joe Flacco on Red Zone, so that's fun. This season, his 23.1 completion percentage allowed is the 2nd lowest in the NFL, and his 7.5 passer rating allowed is the 2nd lowest, and those stats aren't even counting whatever's going on in this Colts-Titans game right now, so it's possible he's doing even better now. Regardless, it seems that consensus was still right on him. 2024 is his 4th straight year as the Titans starting safety, and he's getting paid as a top half of the league safety in the NFL. He's been up and down as a run defender, and he struggled as a tackler, so maybe the Dogs should look for someone else to protect them from Isaiah Buggs, but he's been a quality starter for the Titans. Although he's been injury prone, any team getting his production and starting time with a 3rd round pick would be happy. 11-4. Maybe all of this Hooker talk is making you sweat. Montez Sweat, that is. An edge rusher from Mississippi State who is viewed by consensus as the number 9 overall player in the 2019 class, peaking at number 5 overall, but would fall 17 spots to number 26 overall when he was taken by the Commanders. Going into 2024, in his first 5 seasons, Sweat has started 76 of 76 games, played almost 3,400 snaps, finished in the top 15 in total pressures twice, finished in the top 15 in pass rush grade twice, finished in the top 20 in pass rush productivity grade twice, finished in the top 15 in sacks twice, finished in the top 7 in PFF run D grade twice, has 1 Pro Bowl selection, is the 6th highest paid edge rusher in terms of APY, and is the first player in NFL history to lead 2 teams in sacks during a single season. That last one doesn't really matter as much, but it's kind of fun. Sweat is not a tier 1 edge rusher in my opinion, so maybe it would have been a closer call if he was ranked at number 5 overall, but from 6 to 10 you expect high level starters, and Sweat is close to one based on his production and contract. Maybe he's closer to valued at number 15 overall, which is supported by the fact that his PFR approximate value is 17th in this class, but 9 is closer to 15 than 26, so that'd still go to consensus. Although you ideally want to see an extra Pro Bowl or an All-Pro in there to justify the difference between an early first and a late first, I think Sweat's metrics, contract, and Pro Bowl selection justify finding that consensus was right on this pick, which ends this video with a score of 11-5. And with that, we've just about covered every one of the biggest fallers from the 2019 NFL Draft. Think I left someone out? Let me know below. And if I get enough names, maybe I'll do a part 3 to the 2019 fallers. In the meantime, the next video will be even more reaches of the 2019 draft, so make sure you catch up on the whole series so far so you're not out of the loop. Once I finish that video, I'll be revisiting the biggest reachers and fallers of different drafts, so make sure to comment which draft you'd like me to revisit next. But that's enough for today, fellas. Later.